Intertestament period. The last book of the written in the Old Testament was either Nehemiah or Malachi. It's hard to say because they both are kind of in the same period, the return from captivity, Babylonian captivity. Now, we say there were no books written in the Intertestament period, or Interestimate period if you prefer. But there are things written about the Intertestament period in Daniel. Gave up on it too soon, didn't you? Daniel goes into great detail about many of the events in the Intertestament period. And as we go through this and look at some things, we'll mention that. One of the reasons that Daniel, by liberal critics, is considered to have been written in the period of the Maccabees, we'll find that in here, is that he makes such accurate predictions. Now, here's the thing, though. If you say, okay, Daniel was written in about 160, he's also talking about the Roman Empire. He's talking about Roman emperors. He's talking about Jesus coming. In fact, one of the reasons there was so much expectation for a Messiah when Jesus did come was because they saw in Daniel that it was time. So Daniel covers a fair bit of the territory with kings and rulers and their wives and their intrigues and their battles and all kind of stuff. It's fascinating. And even if you try to stop him short and say, well, he knew about that, well, then you have the question, how do you know about it? Who was writing all that history down for Daniel to look at and say, oh, here we go. But there's a whole lot more to what he predicts as he projects forward from there. And in fact, if you take Daniel and compare it to Revelation, you can figure out when the book of Revelation was written. For another time. So, the Intertestament period. After Nehemiah, after the return from captivity, after Malachi, we have eras. I scarfed this out of the Believer's Bible Commentary, and I like the way they divided it up. And they say that there are 6 historical divisions in the Intertestament period, and I would agree with that. And here they are. Quickly, the Persian period, the Greek era, the Egyptian era, the Syrian era, the Maccabean era, the Roman era. So, what happened? The Babylonian captivity. What happened to cause the Jews to come back? Are the Babylonians still in charge when the Jews come back? No. Who's in charge? Yes. Persians, right? You remember the handwriting on the wall in Daniel chapter 5? Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And the last king of Babylon, actually he's a co-ruler with his father. That's why he offered Daniel third place in the kingdom, because he and his dad were the two that were there. Belshazzar. Daniel's Babylonian name is Belteshazzar. So he doesn't know what's going on. It scares him to death. His knees start knocking. And they've kind of put Daniel on the shelf. And one of the ladies, probably Nebuchadnezzar's one of his wives, and Nebuchadnezzar is called Belshazzar's father. He's not father in the sense of, he was his progenitor, but in the line of kings and what. And she said, there was this man back in Nebuchadnezzar's day, who could interpret dreams and signs and such. And so they find Daniel, they bring him out. And he says, I'll make you the third ruler in the kingdom. And people wondered what that meant. And of course, skeptics would say, that doesn't mean anything. But as I told you, Belshazzar was the son. His father had gone off. He was a nut. And he'd gone off all throughout the empire looking at all the religions. And he just happened to come back along about this time. But his son, he didn't care anything about affairs of state or anything. So Belshazzar, for all intents and purposes, is the king. So Daniel says, I don't want anything you've got to give me. But I'll tell you anyway. So, Menelik-Upharsin, he's been weighed in the balances and found wanting. His kingdom's going to be taken away from him. And the Persians are surrounding the great wall city of Babylon. And there's a lot of interesting history about what happens, because Babylon had huge, ginormous walls. And so the Persians are there. Well, there's this guy named Ugbaru, not to be confused with Subaru, and it's a little Bible joke there. Ugbaru, and there's another guy with a very similar name, and so for a while they were confused. But Ugbaru had fallen out of favor with the good people in Babylon. And he goes over to the Persians. And he says, I'll go back to the city, and I'll help you to get in. And they said, you left under bad circumstances. They're going to pay attention to you. So he came up with this amazing plan. Think about it. Did your grandmother ever say, cut off your nose to spite your face? It may go back to this. He cut his nose and his ears off, so they would think the Persians had tortured him, and they would let him kind of. So he arranges for them to be able to get into the city. One of the things, the Tigris-Euphrates area, I can't remember which one it was, but would flow through the city, so they diverted it. Did some things like that, and Babylon fell that night that handwriting was on the wall. So Persia takes over, and the Persians allow the Jews to come back. And so there's the Persian period, and that's here from 397 to 336, where they're reigning, they're the dominant power in the Middle East. Now, who takes over from the Persians? What do we have? Does Daniel have a dream about a statue? How many major parts are in the statue? 4. Who has the dream? This is what starts getting him in good with Nebuchadnezzar. They kind of join up. Daniel says to tell the king that he can't do dreams any more than anybody else, but he serves a God that can. And here's an interesting thing, because Nebuchadnezzar said, I'll kill all of these people, these conjurers, these pagans, these idolaters, because he says, you tell me the dream. I'm not going to tell you what it is so you can interpret it. Anybody can do that, make something up. So he's figured them out. And so he'd have killed them. But Daniel didn't say, well, I'll wait till he kills all those pagans, then I'll go in there. No. So he has mercy on human beings. There's a message there, I think. So he said, you great king, you're the head of gold, Babylon. Then what comes? The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. And at the bottom, Rome, iron mixed with clay. When Rome has gotten so far flung, they become vulnerable. And in those days, because he sees a stone hitting the base of the statue and kaplong. In those days, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that cannot be destroyed. All other kingdoms will be destroyed before, but it itself will abide forever. The Messianic kingdom. So, We got all that going on. And the Greeks, who do we think of with the Greeks that's the big dog that leads to the Persians falling? Alexander the Great. He doesn't reign for very long. He's a young man, but man, he's all the way over to India. The Persians, one of the things they contribute, I don't think this is in here, I didn't see it, but one of the things they contribute is it's in Esther and it's in Daniel when the Persians have taken over. The law of the Medes and Persians alters not. What happens? Esther intervenes, right? Because Haman has gotten the king to sign an order that we can just go out and kill the Jews. He can't countermand that order. The law of the Medes and Persians alters not. When they throw Daniel in the lion's den, the law, the Medes and Persians alters not. So what they do in Esther's time is they allow another law that the Jews can defend themselves. And by the way, we're going to warn them that folks are going to be trying to kill them. So it takes all the fun out of it when you do that. And the Jews made it. So one of the things we get from Persia is laws that even the king has to obey. And so the rule of law is something that comes forward into the Roman Empire. In fact, they're about ready to do whatever they want to with Saul of Tarsus, and what does he say? I'm a Roman citizen. And they, So he said, I want my case to be tried before the emperor. And that's what they do, because he as a citizen has the right as a citizen to have his case taken where it needs to go. So the Persians have, it's gone on down the line. Rome kind of is an amalgamation of the other empires, and they bring things in. And one of the things they bring in is the rule of law, which comes in very handy. Now, the Greeks, under Alexander, they make a contribution to the fullness of time. Galatians, in the fullness of time, when the time was right. Now, can you think of what the Greeks put into the mix to help things go well for the kingdom?
Knowledge, learning.
Language. Today, the language that more people can speak than any other language is English. Used to be, what was the diplomatic language during the Revolutionary War? French. Well, more people than anything else in the Roman world, because of Alexander the Great spreading, and Hellenism, that's the proper word for Greece. He spread the culture and he spread the language, and people really liked it. So I know they could speak in tongues, but nevertheless, there were already a lot of people that could speak Greek wherever they went. And that's why the New Testament is written in Greek, because most people could read that. And sometimes you can read a language and not speak it. Most everybody could read it, or they could understand it if it was spoken to them. So the Greeks kind of do that. Now, Alexander doesn't live, he's a young man when either he dies, either he drank himself to death, or somebody killed him. But they're still looking for his tomb. And what happens, Daniel talks about this. When the Grecian top dog is done away with, 4 come up in his place. 4 divisions of Alexander's empire come into being headed up by one of his generals. And the 2 that have the most to do with our New Testament and with Jesus and with the Holy Land are the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. Seleucus was a general, and he has the Syrian area north of Palestine. the Ptolemies, or if you prefer, the Ptolemies, they have the south. And for the first part of that time, the Ptolemies, they're pretty benevolent. The Persians had been pretty benevolent too. They had let you practice your religion. They let the Jews go back and build the temple back up and all that. That was their policy. The Babylonians and the Assyrians, they had the opposite approach. They'd kind of move people into your area and move you to other areas to dispel your sense of nationalism. But the Persians had a more benevolent policy. They would rather you like them and serve them because of that. So in the Greeks, the Ptolemies partook of that spirit, if you will. And so when the Ptolemies were holding sway, then things worked well. And the Grecian era is that. Cleopatra was a Greek. In fact, she was the seventh of 7 Cleopatras. And she, of course, walked like an Egyptian, as we know. I can't resist these things. I don't know what it is. So you've got the Egyptian period, which is the Egyptian part of the Greek Empire, the Ptolemies. And then you go over here, you've got the Syrian era. That's the Seleucid part of the Greek era, still holding sway over the land, one of Alexander's general. In fact, the general that started out being Antigonus, but Seleucus took over from him and got the territory. And so Antiochus, or Antiochus if you want to call him that, or you can call Darius if you want to. Everybody else does. So Antiochus Epiphanes, he goes down to wage war with the Ptolemy faction. He goes through the Holy Land. Does it right in the middle. Goes through there, and he comes down to wage war against Egypt, in essence. Now, Rome is emerging as the power in the Mediterranean. And they would just as soon not get into a fight with Antiochus Epiphanes. They've got other things they want to take care of first. But on the other hand, they don't want him to take over Egypt and become more powerful. And so they send a Roman general over from the island of Crete. And he goes and he wants to talk to Antiochus Epiphanes. And I think he's sort of kind of flattered that Rome would, he's probably thinking they're going to work something out or whatever. And so he tells Antiochus that Rome really doesn't want him to pursue this war. And he says, I'm paraphrasing here. He says, that's a heavy load for me to process. I need some time. And one of the famous moments of history, the Roman general pulls out his sword, draws a circle around Antiochus and says, you take all the time you want, but you give me an answer before you leave the circle. This does not make him a happy man. And he knows he doesn't need to go against Rome. So off he goes. He's in a foul mood. And he goes back through the Holy Land. So he takes it out on the Jews. He uses the temple as a place to offer pig sacrifices to Zeus, and just generally messes everything up. So that's going on. Now, if you look at down here, the next is the Maccabean. We're going to transition from Antiochus. He's just really going to go all in with this. So he's got some people that's going to teach the Jews how to offer pig sacrifices, and he converts the temple into a temple of Zeus. And he's got his peeps down there teaching the folks, the priests, who many of the priests have already started leaning into the Greek ways, the Hellenistic ways, and so they've already kind of, to some extent, compromised, but not everybody has. And so he's there, they're there, and they're giving instructions. And one of the apostate priests is helping the Greek guy teach him how to do pigs. And we're used to that. And the Maccabees, It's actually the Hasmonean family, Maccabees, the Hammers. He's just had enough. So he kills the Greek guy, and he kills the apostate priest guy, and he starts a revolt known as the Maccabean Revolt. And that lasts for approximately 7 years. You've all heard of Hanukkah, have you not? Hanukkah, if you want to get technical. That is the Feast of Dedication. Do we read in the Gospels about a Feast of Dedication? I wouldn't ask it if there wasn't one there, so you could say, yeah, yes. But of course we do. Everybody knows that. John 10. Jesus is at the Feast of Dedication. What is the Feast of Dedication? Okay, Hanukkah is the Feast of Lights, right? Right. They were about to run out of oil in the temple. It's under siege. And according to the way the Maccabees tell it, there was a miraculous extension of the light. Hence, it's the Feast of Lights. And they were able to cleanse the temple from all that pig stuff and all those foreigners that were in it, and restore proper sacrifices and establish an independent Jewish state. The Romans eventually kind of work out a deal with them where if you'll be nice to us, we won't hurt you and that. But still, they're there, and they've got their own people. The Maccabees are the ruling family, and they're Levites. And when the Maccabees decide that they're not happy with just claiming the priestly side of things, and the high priest got to be a very, 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 very political office. It was more secular. So they decide that, well, we're going to be kings too. Now, what's wrong with that from the get-go for Levites to do something like that? Where did the kings come from? Work with me. Judah, David. Okay. And so the conservative element, the separatist that we know as Pharisees, this doesn't go over very well with them at all. So we've got a division between the priestly ruling aristocracy, and they're going to take advantage of this, got a lot of money, got a lot of wealth, got a lot of this and that, and the Pharisees, who are purists. They started out really well. They started out trying to preserve the law of Moses. And one of the things that kind of was the straw that broke the camel's back was when they decided, well, we're just going to be kings too. Now, there is a prophecy in the Old Testament about a priest king, Zechariah chapter 6. Who's that talking about? Jesus. But what does the Hebrews writer say about the priest king Jesus? While he was on earth, he couldn't have been a king. Why? Because the law of Moses and how it worked itself out had Judah and David as the king. So you had to do away with the law of Moses before Jesus could be a priest king. And the Hebrews writer, among other things, points that out. That the way was clear for him to put the two offices together, which is what Zechariah said. He'd make peace between the two offices. So, that sort of lets us know where the Sadducees come from. They are, in Jesus' day, the religious aristocracy, and they have the high priest. And the high priest office is very, very, very political. And the Pharisees, who started out as you might even say, restorationist, they go to seed and become legalist. The danger of liberalism, primary, is that you drift so far away from the Bible that it doesn't really play a role at all in what you do. And you see that today. What got voted on? I think it was today. If it wasn't today, it was yesterday by the United Methodist Church. Anybody?
The clergy. Their clergy
They can now, they've got one more vote to go, but it was like 600 and something to 50. And so the clergy can now be practicing, I can never say that. It's my dyslexia. Somebody help me. LBGTQ plus, because it's, okay. So now you can identify with that, and you'll be able to be clergy in the United Methodist Church. Now, there's only one thing wrong with that, is that the Bible teaches otherwise. It doesn't teach to be ugly, it doesn't teach to be nasty, it doesn't teach to be, anything that would be offensive in the sense of our character and our integrity and our kindness or anything like that, but it does teach that that's wrong. And in essence, they're saying very plainly what the Bible says we don't care. In our time, in our culture, in our day, this is what matters. And that's what happens. I mean, even the United Methodist Church, which is known pretty much as a liberal denomination, they still had on paper until just the other day that could not be. So that liberalism tends to drift away from the Bible emphasis that you have. Now, conservatism tends to drift to legalism because you get so caught up with law that you're not happy with the ones you got. You got to make some more. People need help, And we've talked about hedges around the Torah. Well, if the Bible says this, we'll put a hedge over here so it'll be hard for them to get through that and break the law. And then, let's put another one. Let's put another one. Let's put another one. And by the time of Jesus' day, every time he moves, especially on the Sabbath, he's breaking a law. Not breaking a law that God put out there, but breaking one of their laws. And there's all kind of things like that. One of the things is washing your hands. We talked about that the other day. And where's it got hand washing in the Old Testament? It doesn't have it. But your disciples aren't washing their hands before they eat, so they're defiled when they eat. Later they'll say Jesus didn't wash his hands either, but in Mark 7 and Matthew 15, that's the issue. Where did that come from? In fact, Mark gives some explanation because he's writing to a Gentile audience. He says, here's what the Jews were doing. Matthew's writing to Jews. They know what's going on. And so Jesus says, let's talk a bit about this. You and your traditions, the traditions of the elders. He says, Moses, actual commandment, Moses said to honor your father and mother. And you've come up with a rule, a law, that says we'll declare anything that was going to be used for our mother and father to be Corban. Remember Achan and Jericho? That's Corban. This is God's first fruits. So he said, you have taken God's law and for some ridiculous reasoning of yours come up with this thing which actually undoes God's law, which is what traditions begin to do. You can't really serve the law like God wants to serve because you got these other things in the way that come to be more important. And one of the things that does, it creates a self-righteous attitude because you can have a longer list of things that you do than the regular guy on the street. Oh, we do this. And what does the Pharisee say to himself when he's praying to God? And there's the tax collector. Well, I do this, and I do this, and I do this, and I do this, and I do this. I'm not like him. And in fact, he did do this, and he did do this, and he did do this, and he did do this. Talks about fasting. Where's the Old Testament command fasting? There's one day in the whole calendar, Day of Atonement. That's it. It's a nationalistic fast. There's no personal fasting command in the Old Testament. But you remember how that's even brought to Jesus, John's disciples fast. The Pharisees fast. Everybody's fasting. He said, essentially, your disciples don't fast. He said, no, they don't. He said, while I'm here with them, there's nothing for them to be sad about. When I leave, they'll be sad. They'll fast. So that's what tends to happen. And the Pharisees were the biggest influence because what happens with liberalism is they're the religious aristocracy. They got the money. They got the position. They don't want to fool with the people. But the Pharisees have to have the people to have power. You see, that's all they got left. And so that's what people do. They become populists. They want to stir up the populace. That's where they get their power. They don't have the vested interest in government, and they don't have this and that, but they've got the people. And the people, it was a love-hate relationship, because legalism is not fun. And legalists are not happy. I mean, when you're not happy, you don't want anybody else to be happy, so they did a good job of that. So what happens at the end of the Sermon on the Mount? Because what's he say? Except your righteousness exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will no wise enter the kingdom of heaven. And he starts, what he starts doing there, he's saying, you've encountered these things, you've even heard these verses, but what the Pharisees do with them and what I'm going to tell you to do with them is completely different. Here's what I'm going to tell you. And the people at the end of the sermon, what are they? They're amazed at his teaching, because he taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes. And those scribes were doctors of the law that were affiliated with the Pharisees. So, the liberals don't care. They've got their money, they got their position, they got their wealth, they got their this, they got their that. They don't care. They don't need us. But legalists need people to join with them in their legalism and their self-righteousness. Because everyone that they take in can then say to these other people over here, and they don't, but we do. I know we would never do anything like that, but if we did. So this is what's going on when Jesus comes on the scene. They've come into the Roman era, taking over the Maccabees' independent state. They're the occupying force there, and hence we find things like going the second mile, because a Roman soldier could make you go one, but not two. And you say, I'll go two anyway. And we want to crucify this guy, but you can't do that because you got to let us, Pilate, Rome. And so we encounter Rome as we do the Sadducees and the Pharisees. And a lot of people can speak the Greek language. And Rome offers another thing that was huge in the book of Acts. They just dug one up the other day, I saw. Roads. They still use those roads. They had road beds 6 feet deep. They knew how to build roads. Well, have you heard the expression, all roads lead to Rome? How much help is that going to be if you're going out in the Roman Empire to preach the gospel? It's going to be a huge help. It's going to be a huge help because you're basically protected by Roman law. It's going to be a huge help because you can go places and there are going to be a lot of people there who can speak Greek. And since you came from Galilee, which is a trilingual area, which has Latin and Aramaic and synagogue Hebrew and Greek, you're already ready to talk to a lot of people without even having to use the gift of tongues. So, God set the table through these world empires and their subdivisions that go down through time. And so when Jesus comes, God has put that all into place. And he's got people so tired of the Pharisees that when they hear Jesus preach, they're just, wow, this is amazing. Anyway, there we go. Thank you, whoever suggested this.